The very first card is the Empress, and that already tells me why this connection feels so intense. Because symbolically, the Empress is not about chasing. She doesn't run after attention. She creates an atmosphere people want to stay inside. And I feel like that is the first thing this person cannot get over about you. You have this way of making someone feel wanted without making them feel like your entire world depends on them. That combination is dangerous. Warm, affectionate, present, but still completely your own person. And I think this person notices it more than they admit. It may be something very small. The way you listen when they're talking. The way you remember one tiny detail they mentioned weeks ago, the way you can be soft with them, laugh with them, make them feel comfortable, and then go right back to your own life without begging for reassurance. That does something to them. Because psychologically, the Empress represents value that doesn't need to announce itself. So in this dynamic, they may look at you and think, why do I feel so good around this person? And why do I also feel like I could lose them if I don't step up? And that is where the obsession starts to make sense. Not obsession in some mystical, guaranteed sense. This is symbolism, but the pattern here is fascination mixed with insecurity. You make closeness feel natural, but you do not make yourself easy to possess. And I'm getting that this person may replay tiny interactions because of that. A look, a compliment, the way you pulled your attention away, the moment you seemed completely focused on them, and then suddenly you weren't. But here's what is interesting. I don't think the Empress is showing the deepest reason they are attached to you. This is only the first layer. The second thing is much more emotional, and honestly, it may explain why they can act confident one moment and strangely distant the next. Because the next card is going to show what you do that makes them feel exposed. And I think that exposure comes from something very specific. You notice imbalance, not in a calculating way. Not like you're sitting there keeping score of who texted first, who gave more, who cared more. It's subtler than that. You seem to notice when someone is giving you one version of themselves while feeling something completely different underneath. So this person can say, I'm fine, and maybe you don't challenge them. You don't immediately say, no, you're not. Tell me what's wrong. But you heard the pause, you noticed the tone change. You noticed that they were warm 5 minutes ago and suddenly became a little more careful with you. And sometimes I think what exposes them is that you let them have that moment without chasing after it. Because now they're left wondering how much you actually noticed. That is the second thing. You have this ability to make someone feel understood without forcing them to explain themselves before they're ready. And psychologically, that can be incredibly intimate because most people respond to emotional distance in one of two ways. They either push harder, what's wrong? Why are you acting weird? Or they become distant themselves. But your energy here feels different. You can notice something changed and still remain warm. You can give someone space without punishing them for needing it. And you can care without immediately demanding proof that they care the same amount. That balance matters, especially with someone who may be used to controlling how much other people get to see. They can hide behind confidence. They can make a joke. They can act casual. They can suddenly become busy right after a moment that felt a little too intimate, and you may not call any of it out. But somehow, they know you saw it. That is where the first thing and the second thing start working together. You make them feel wanted, but you don't cling. You understand them, but you don't invade. So there is nowhere obvious for them to push against. And again, this does not guarantee what another person secretly feels. We're looking at the psychological symbolism of the dynamic. But if this resonates, I think the most interesting part is not that you can see through this person. It's what they seem to do immediately after they realize that you can. And I think what happens next is that they try to regain control. Because being noticed is one thing. Being understood when you were actively trying not to be understood, that's different. Maybe they make a joke right after saying something unusually honest. Maybe they tell you something personal and then immediately change the subject. Maybe there's a moment where the energy between you feels undeniably close, and 5 minutes later, they're suddenly acting like everything is completely casual. And you notice that too. But what makes this so interesting is that you don't necessarily expose the contradiction. You don't say, "Why are you pretending you don't care now?" You might just keep talking. You might smile. You might give them enough space to recover without pretending you didn't feel what just happened. And I think that can be strangely comforting for this person because around you, they may not have to explain every emotion perfectly. They don't have to immediately find the right words. If they get nervous, you don't necessarily make the nervousness bigger. If they become quiet, you don't instantly fill the silence because you're afraid something is wrong. You let the moment breathe. But that same quality can make them feel incredibly vulnerable because there's this thought underneath it. They notice that. Maybe this person tries to sound indifferent about someone giving you attention, but you hear something slightly sharper in their voice. Maybe they act completely confident, but there's a hesitation before they ask you a certain question. Maybe they pull back after revealing more than they planned to, and instead of chasing them for an explanation, you simply stay yourself, warm, normal, present, and that can be almost more exposing than confrontation. Because if you confronted them, they could defend themselves, they could deny it, explain it away, turn it into an argument. But when you understand something and don't force them to admit it, they're left alone with the possibility that you already know. That's the emotional contradiction here. You make them feel safe enough to lower the performance. And then they realize you noticed the performance in the first place. So the first thing is still there. You care without becoming dependent. But this second thing goes deeper. You perceive without pressuring, and if their behavior sometimes feels warm, then suddenly cautious, especially after a moment where you seem to understand them a little too accurately. I would pay attention to what happened right before that shift, because that shift can tell you where the vulnerability actually entered. Maybe everything was easy until the conversation became personal. Maybe they were texting freely, flirting, giving you attention, and then you said something that made them feel a little too understood. Suddenly, the rhythm changes. They take longer to respond. They become more casual. They mention how busy they are, how independent they are, how they're not really thinking about anything serious. Or they make a joke right when the moment starts feeling emotionally real. And I want to be careful here because distance does not automatically mean love. Someone pulling away can mean 100 different things: lack of interest, stress, confusion, bad timing, their own emotional habits. So I'm not saying they disappeared for 3 days, therefore they're secretly obsessed. That's not what this is. What I'm noticing in this particular dynamic is the timing. If the distance consistently appears right after closeness, there may be something about vulnerability that makes this person feel like they need to get their footing again. Almost like, okay, I showed too much. Let me pull this back. And this is where you become difficult for them to predict. Because you don't necessarily panic. You notice that their energy changed, but you still go to work. You still see your friends. You still answer when you genuinely want to answer. You don't suddenly send a paragraph explaining everything you meant because they became slightly quieter, and I think they noticed that. Maybe, consciously or not, there's a moment where they expect you to close the distance for them, to ask if they're upset, to reassure them, to chase the version of them that was warmer yesterday. But you don't always do it, not because you're trying to punish them. You simply don't abandon yourself every time someone else becomes uncertain. And that changes the entire emotional balance. Because you saw the shift, you probably understood more of it than they wanted you to, and still, you didn't scramble to fix it. So now they have to sit with whatever they were trying to avoid. And I think that's why calling you hard to get would actually miss the point. You're not necessarily hard to get. You're just not auditioning for a place in someone else's life. And that is very different from being emotionally unavailable. Because emotionally unavailable would mean you never really let them in. But you do. You can be affectionate. You can flirt. You can tell them you miss them. You can enjoy the moment without pretending you don't care. And then you still have a life. You still have plans that existed before them. You still have standards. You still have people you love, things you're working toward, places your attention needs to go. So, when an interaction ends beautifully, you don't always need to turn around and ask, was that as meaningful to you as it was to me? You can let it be meaningful. If they take longer to respond, maybe you notice. Maybe part of you even wonders what changed. But you don't necessarily send 3 more messages trying to restore the feeling. And if you disagree with them, you can actually disagree. You don't have to immediately soften your opinion because you're afraid one uncomfortable moment will make them disappear. That is what makes this so intense. Because this person can't easily convince themselves that you don't care. There has probably been enough warmth for them to know that isn't true. But they also can't assume that caring means unlimited access to you. And I think that distinction may scare them more than simple distance ever could. Because distance is easy to explain. They weren't interested. They never really liked me. They were unavailable. But with you, the explanation isn't that clean. You can care and still leave something that isn't meeting you properly. You can understand that they need reassurance and still not rush in every single time they become uncertain. You might even sense when they want you to say, no, no, I'm still here. You still have me. And sometimes you probably give that reassurance naturally. But you don't always rescue them from every uncomfortable feeling. And here's what I think they may have misunderstood about you. They may have called this mystery, but it might actually be stability. You're not constantly moving closer and farther away to create an effect. You're simply not losing your center. And once someone becomes emotionally attached to that, there's a deeper fear underneath all of this because eventually staying on the surface stops working. At some point, they have to decide whether they're going to keep protecting themselves or actually let you closer. And when they do let you closer, I think something very different happens. You don't immediately use that access against them. Maybe they admit they were jealous. Maybe they tell you they were more affected by something than they wanted you to know. Maybe they finally say, yeah, that actually bothered me after spending days pretending it didn't. And you could make them pay for that admission. You could say, I knew it. You could remind them how obvious they were. You could push for every detail now that the door is finally open, but I don't think that that's what they experience with you. You listen. You let theirs be a pause. If they say something embarrassing, you don't necessarily make the embarrassment bigger. If they laugh because they're uncomfortable, you might recognize what the laugh is covering without immediately exposing it. And if they tell you something private, you remember that it was given to you in a vulnerable moment. You don't casually throw it back at them later just because you're upset. That creates a very specific kind of safety. Because now they're learning that being known by you does not automatically mean losing control of how they're treated. They can show you something imperfect and you don't suddenly reduce them to that one thing. And I think that can make someone lower defenses they normally keep very organized. For a moment, they don't have to be impressive. They don't have to have the perfect answer. They don't have to pretend they weren't jealous, nervous, hurt, confused, or more emotionally invested than they plan to be. They can just be there. But then the moment ends, and sometimes that is when the exposure hits them. Later, they may think, why did I tell them that? They might become slightly more controlled the next day, more casual, a little harder to read. Again, that does not mean every withdrawal is secretly romantic. But in this particular pattern, closeness may be followed by restraint because they suddenly realize how safe they felt. And that's what makes this deeper than attraction. Because they may not only miss you, they may miss the version of themselves that doesn't have to stay guarded around you. And once that happens, even the smallest memories can start carrying much more weight than you would expect. And that emotional importance usually doesn't announce itself in some huge dramatic moment. Sometimes it shows up in something almost annoyingly small. They hear someone use a phrase you use. They pass a place you mentioned once. They order something and suddenly remember that you knew exactly how they liked it without them having to explain it twice. And for a second, there you are again. Not because they were sitting around trying to think about you. It just happens. Maybe they remember the way you looked at them while they were telling a story and realized you were actually listening. Not waiting for your turn to speak. Listening. Maybe they remember being uncomfortable in a room, and without drawing attention to it, you somehow made things easier. You changed the subject. You moved closer. You made a joke, something tiny that said, I noticed. And then you never made them thank you for noticing. That matters. Because those little memories contain both things we've been talking about. There's warmth in them, but there's also space. You gave them attention without making the attention feel like a transaction. You understood something without forcing them to explain what you understood. So when the memory comes back, it feels comforting and unfinished. They may wonder, did that mean as much to them as it did to me? They may have a conversation with someone else and suddenly realize how easy it was to talk to you. They may almost send you something because it reminded them of you, then stop for a second because sending it would admit something. It would admit that you crossed their mind, that this mattered. And I think there's another part of this that you may not realize. You might assume the moments that affected them most were the moments when you looked your best, said the perfect thing, flirted intentionally, or knew you were being charming. But I'm not sure those are the moments that stayed. It may have been when you weren't trying at all, when you laughed without thinking about how you looked, when you got distracted by something you genuinely cared about, when you were completely yourself and forgot to manage the impression you were making. Because that is when they got the clearest glimpse of you. And eventually, enough of those little moments add up. until this stops feeling like chemistry. It stops feeling like curiosity. And they have to confront the possibility that you have become emotionally important to them. And once someone becomes emotionally important, the questions change. It's no longer just, do I like them? Now it becomes, do I still have a place with them? They may start noticing things they didn't pay attention to before. A slightly shorter reply, a day when you seem more focused on your own life. The fact that you mentioned plans they weren't part of. And suddenly, something very small can register differently. Not because you did anything wrong, but because your attention matters more now. Maybe they feel unexpectedly relieved when you reach out first. Maybe they become curious about what you're doing next weekend, next month, where your life is going. Maybe they hear someone else compliment them, flirt with them, give them attention, and realize it doesn't create the same feeling. Because attention was never really the entire point with you. It was how you gave it. Warmly, without trying to own them. And it was how you understood them. Quietly, without forcing them to expose every thought before they were ready. That combination becomes difficult to replace once someone has actually experienced it. And I think that is when the possibility of losing access to you can start feeling much more serious than they expected. But here's where it gets complicated. Realizing you're attached to someone does not automatically make you brave. Sometimes it does the opposite. Someone can suddenly become more careful precisely because now there is something to lose. They may measure their words more, watch your reactions more closely, want reassurance, and then act like they don't need it. And again, mixed signals are still mixed signals. You do not have to tolerate endless confusion just because someone may be struggling with vulnerability. Their feelings, whatever they are, still have to eventually meet you through behavior. But I think there's a reversal here that explains a lot. This person may have spent time thinking you were difficult to read, wondering what you really felt, wondering how much they mattered. But maybe the deeper discomfort was never that you were impossible to understand. Maybe it was that around you, they felt unusually easy to understand. You noticed the nervousness beneath the confidence, the attachment underneath the casual tone, the feeling underneath the joke. And now that this connection actually matters, there may be one thing they want from you more than anything else. Something very simple, but asking for it would require them to admit just how much you matter. And I think what they want is reassurance, not constant reassurance, not proof every 5 minutes. Just something clear enough that they don't have to keep wondering whether this connection is happening only inside their own head. Maybe they want you to reach out because you genuinely thought about them. Maybe they want to hear you say, I really liked being with you, without having to pull the words out of you. Maybe they want some small indication that when the interaction ends, you carry a piece of it with you too. But here's the contradiction. They don't actually want you to become a completely different person in order to give them that, because the independence is part of what affected them in the first place. If you suddenly started chasing every silence, over-explaining every feeling, rearranging your whole life around their attention, something about the dynamic would change. And at the same time, if you became intentionally cold just to make them want you more, that would change it too. Because this was never about playing hard to get. You weren't attractive because you withheld affections strategically. You were attractive because when you gave affection, it felt real. And when you went back to your own life, that was real too. That's the difference. You can send the message because you want to send it. You can say, I had a really good time with you and leave it there. You can be direct about liking someone without turning that honesty into, "Now, please tell me exactly how much you like me back." You can offer warmth while still expecting reciprocity. And I think this person may secretly want exactly that from you, a sign, something that says, "Yes, this mattered to me too." But eventually, that creates a choice for them. Because reassurance can only carry a connection so far. At some point, they either remain in the safety of ambiguity, where nothing has to be fully admitted, or they risk becoming more honest about what this actually means to them. I can't tell you which one they choose. But before we close this reading, there's one more thing I want to bring together. Because when you put these two specific qualities side by side, you can see why this may have affected them so much more deeply than ordinary attraction. And I think that deeper effect comes from the fact that these two things normally don't exist together this easily. Someone can be warm, but sometimes that warmth comes with expectation. Someone can be independent, but sometimes that independence feels like distance. Someone can understand you deeply, but sometimes being understood feels invasive, like every emotion is being pulled apart before you're ready to talk about it. And with you, the combination seems different. You can make this person feel wanted without making them responsible for your entire emotional world. And you can understand what they're feeling without forcing them to hand over every private part of themselves. So they get closeness without feeling trapped. They get space without feeling abandoned. And I think that is why some of those tiny moments may have landed harder than either of you expected. The detail you remembered weeks later, the look you gave them when they said something that didn't quite match what they were feeling, the way you listened completely, then went back to whatever you were doing. The moment they showed you something vulnerable, became slightly distant afterward, and realized you weren't going to punish them for it or chase them down for an explanation. Those things seem small, but emotionally, they communicate something very specific. I can care about you deeply and still remain myself. And maybe that is the part this person keeps coming back to. Because you're not asking them to disappear into you, but you're also showing them that you won't disappear into them. There's a difference, and that difference creates respect alongside attraction. Now, I do want to keep this grounded. A symbolic reading cannot prove what another person privately feels. And however intense a connection may seem, real love eventually has to become visible through consistency, honesty, effort, communication, and reciprocity. You should not have to decode someone forever. But if this reading is describing your dynamic, then I think the strongest thing about you is actually much simpler than obsession. You know how to get close without losing yourself. You can be soft without becoming powerless. You can understand someone without taking responsibility for everything they refuse to say. And maybe that is why your presence stays with them. Because the thing they're drawn to most is not something you learn to perform for love. It's the fact that you can love deeply and still know how to walk away from anything that asks you to abandon yourself.